Hi, everybody. Dr. Jay Brower here to talk to you about organizational culture. All right, organizational culture theory is a very important and valuable theory because it relates to aspects of our lives, especially our working lives, that we'll all face at some point. So, like groupthink, which helps us take into consideration the reality of highly cohesive groups, organizational culture theory helps us think through how groups get to places of productivity and then also dissolution. So when we think about what a highly effective group or organization is, we can turn to organizational culture theory. So let me just begin with creating a little bit of structure here. So when we think about the different magnitudes of communication, at the smallest level, we have interpersonal communication, communication between ourselves and one other person in in a relationship kind of situation. Second, we have groups, which is usually defined as three or more. And even though it is a slippery definition, we often think of groups as 3 to 10 people, and then organizations as being 10 and beyond. But there are also some other factors which weigh on how we decide whether a collective is a group or organization. And in part, that has to do with structure, with formal structure that's put upon a collective of people that structures how they act, how they behave, what their goals are, those kinds of things. The more formal the structure, the closer to an organization. The less formal, the more group specific. So, when we think about an organization's culture, we're thinking about the values, the ideas, the beliefs that support people's participation in the organization. And one of the ways this happens is through the composition of shared symbols. And this could be something like a business's or an organization's logo. Think of the red cross here, the white background with just the simple red cross in it. That unites people around a shared symbol that has nearly universal meaning, that these are people here to help. Second, symbols have unique meanings in that they conjure for people a different set of beliefs depending on what the symbol is. So, again, if we go back to the idea of an organization's logo, think of a company like one good example might be McDonald's. So, those golden arches, those have unique meanings. They symbolize McDonald's in its own right. And these kinds of examples are true throughout organizations that are both for profit and nonprofit. And then third, examples of an organization's culture include things like organizational stories, so how the company got its start. Think about a company like Apple, for instance. This idea of being a high-tech, high-design company that tries to formulate a pattern of ease of use for consumers, and how that stands in opposition to their great rival Microsoft. Then also how rituals play in here. What kinds of rituals are specific to the group? So you see increasingly in organizational life, especially in the for-profit world, an interest in keeping employees happy by having things like sports leagues that are played on the campus of Google, where employees get together and have intramural sports, softball, basketball, whatever, have different kinds of retreats, those sorts of things. And then also rites of passage. So, rites of passage would be, say, probationary periods, would be specific benchmarks that once one achieves a certain goal, then they pass on to the next level, say, of importance in the organization, something like that. And ultimately, organizational life is characterized by change because organizations evolve and devolve. So they grow, they branch out, they develop, but they can also devolve in the sense of growing smaller, of withering, of becoming less significant in their marketplace or in their charity space. All right, so organizational culture theory's development comes from Pankowski and O'Donnell Trujillo, and their guiding assumption is that organizations are best understood using a cultural lens. So, using the lens of culture to see how organizations are formed, how they coalesce, how people come in and move out of organization. And from that, they get a sense of how communication amongst the members of an organization facilitate the development of culture. And so when we look to individual organizations, we can find important understanding of how a given organization is formed, how it develops, how members move in and out of it by looking at them specifically rather than just saying, as say business schools might, that here are the characteristics of highly effective organizations across the board. Organizational culture theory says no, we have to look at the individual organization through this cultural lens to understand that organization, and that becomes a more effective way of understanding how organizations work. All right, so culture and organizations are intertwined in a number of ways. So first, understanding individual organizations is more important than generalizing across them, as we just discussed in the last slide there, or saw in the last slide there. And that culture is the essence of organizational life, that it includes emotional and psychological climate. Is this a positive climate? Is it a negative climate? Is it one of competition? Is it one of mutuality? And then also the morale, attitudes, and productivity. So how does worker satisfaction, an attitude that sees their work as important and valued, also lead to productivity in terms of higher output? And then all of this includes symbols and the meaning attached to those symbols. So when there is, say, a high level of connection between workers and the organization that they're part of, there is a kind of meaning invested in the symbols of that organization that is important to organization members' understanding of what they're doing, of how they're acting, and then ultimately what the goal of all those actions are. Some assumptions of organizational culture theory are that members create and maintain a shared sense of organizational reality. So the reality of the organization is something that is symbiotic, that all members are participating in, and all members are relied upon to create this sense of organizational reality. This is sort of the idea that style filters down. And when there is, let's say, a negative style at the top in leadership, then that filters down presumably to throughout the organization. A second major assumption is that the use and interpretation of symbols are critical to an organization's culture. This is why when you head onto the campus of any organization, you're likely to see a lot of branding, a lot of naming of where it's at. If you look around the campus at WestCon, for instance, you'll see on White Street in particular, at the corners of campus, some pretty prominent signs that identify this is the Western Connecticut State University campus. And you go to other campuses, you'll see a lot of branding like that, and that is because there are symbols of the organization. The interpretation of those symbols as positive, as important, as defining is critical then to the organization's culture and its development. And if we look here on this slide, you can see a number of ways in which physical symbols, behavioral symbols, and verbal symbols tie into general practices that exist in organizations. So at the physical symbol level, we would say that's an example of what I was just talking about, of branding in particular at the WCSU campus. So these would be designs and logos, and then how they're used to create a material appearance of the campus. Behavioral symbols, think about on our campus, when students come in their first year, they're often invited to walk through the gates, this symbolic ritual of inviting people to become members of the university community. And then verbal symbols, something like even Western as a name used for Western Connecticut State University. It becomes its own sort of product ideal and branding. And that's it.